I won't say good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, because I know we have a very broad global audience, but a welcome to all of you, wherever you're coming from. I'm Larry Diamond, Senior Fellow at the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, and I co-lead the Arab Reform and Democracy Program with our remarkable Associate Director, Hesham Salem, who will be moderating this session today. We're going to look back on the uprising in Egypt, the January 25th uprising, 10 years later. It was 10 years ago yesterday that one of the Arab world's longest serving dictators and a man who was considered by many a very resilient autocrat was ousted after 18 days of remarkable mass protests in Egypt. The iconic, most iconic piece of the so-called Arab Spring. And we're very honored to have the opportunity, co-sponsored by the 10 Years On project, to look back on this historic event and think about the incomplete struggles and evolving trajectories in Egypt today. To do that, we have, along with Hesham himself, three of the most distinguished scholars of Egypt, two of whom have also been important political activists in Egypt. And so it's now my honor to turn the moderation of the event over to my colleague, Hesham.
Welcome, and thank you for joining us at our event, the January 25th Uprising at 10, brought to you, as Larry mentioned, by the Program on Arab Reform and Democracy at the Center on Democracy, Development, and Rule of Law, and co-sponsored by our partners at the 10 Years On project. And to learn more about that project and its exciting activities, feel free to visit thearabuprisings.org. We're also grateful to our colleagues at the Arab Studies Institute and Jadadiyya for live streaming this panel discussion on Facebook as we speak. We've got an excellent lineup for you guys today. Joel Bainen, Nancy Oqil, Amra Hamzawi. By ways of quick introduction, Joel Bainen is Professor of Middle East History Emeritus at Stanford. He is the former president of MESA and has made numerous contributions to the study of the Middle East, especially Egypt. He's allegedly in retirement, and I say allegedly because he is as active as ever in writing, publishing, mentoring, and teaching. His latest book was released last year, A Critical Political Economy of the Middle East and North Africa, which he co-edited with Bassam, Haddad, and Sherene Seikaly. We also have Nancy Oqil, a long-standing human rights advocate whose contributions to that field are immense. She just completed a visiting scholar fellowship here at CDDRL, but continues to collaborate with the center in various capacities. She is the founder and the former president of the Tahrir Institute in Washington, D.C., currently serves as the chair of its board of advisors. She was also the director of the Freedom House's Egypt program and was one of 43 NGO workers who were prosecuted by the Egyptian government in 2012 in a politically motivated case aimed at clamping down on civil society. Finally, we have our very own Amra Hamzawi, senior research scholar at CDDRL and former research fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. His contributions to the study of Egypt are vast. His latest book, On the Habits of Neo-Authoritarianism, Politics in Egypt between 2013 and 2019, appeared in Arabic in 2019. In the aftermath of the January 25th uprising, he was elected to parliament in Egypt back when there was some semblance of competitive politics in the country. But as you know, with regards to the story of that parliament, it did not end very well for Amr and did not end very well for Egypt for that matter, which is an excellent segue to our panel discussion today. With that, I'll hand it to our first speaker, Joel Bainen. It's all you.
Thank you, Hesham. Thank you, Larry, and thank you to CDDRL and to all of those who have come to this event. Many people at the time and now have called the occupation of Tahrir Square and the other urban squares of Egypt that led to the ouster of former President Hosni Mubarak a revolution. My basic argument is that this is not a very helpful characterization of the events. And the terms Arab Spring and Arab Winter are even less helpful because they obscure the social struggles of the decade preceding former President Mubarak's ouster and which continue today. According to the Arab Network for Human Rights Information, there were 73 labor and social protests in the last quarter of 2020, including 11 labor strikes. This is considerably fewer than the pace of collective action from 2004 to 2016, and many protests suffered severe repression. But it is a much higher level of social struggle than in the Nasser, Sadat, or Mubarak eras. The popular uprising of January 25th, 2011 was partly, although not necessarily consciously, directed against neoliberal Washington consensus economic policies. In that sense, it is comparable to and continuous with the bread intifada of January 1977, which was one of the earliest of the roughly 150 anti-IMF food riots of the late 1970s. The clearest expression of this political economy-driven element in the uprising was the nearly 3,500 collective actions, including 570 strikes, involving some 2.5 million workers from 1998 to 2010. Nonetheless, as labor lawyer, former presidential candidate, and former director of the Egyptian Center for Economic and Social Rights, Khaled Ali perceptively observed, the workers did not start the January 25th movement because they have no organizing structure. But one of the most important steps of this revolution was taken when they began to protest, giving the revolution an economic and social slant besides the political demands. Most Western observers ignored or minimized this aspect of the uprising in both Egypt and Tunisia, where it was particularly pronounced. The January 25th uprising was also linked to the more overtly political protest movements of the 2000s, animated primarily by the young urban intelligentsia, solidarity with the Second Palestinian Intifada, opposition to the 2003 Iraq War, Kifaya, the Egyptian movement for change, whose peak of activity was 2004 to 2006, support for the Judges Club's criticism of the 2005 elections, Mohammed al-Baradei's National Association for Change, the We Are All Khaled Said campaign of 2010, and others. This genealogy suggests that demands for democracy and government respect for the dignity of citizens, especially curbing routine police brutality and torture, and an anti-imperialist foreign policy were a component of the uprising. The mass demonstrations that erupted on January 25th could not have become a revolution because the great majority of the movement's supporters had no common organizational framework or political program beyond the ouster of Mubarak. Most participants, both workers and the urban intelligentsia, did not understand the character of the regime whose demise they sought. This was exemplified by the deeply misguided slogan, "The army and the people are one hand." That slogan blocked people from understanding that Mubarak's removal was as much a coup as due to popular pressure. Under the best of circumstances, Mubarak's ouster alone could not have resulted in a regime change. The officers' republic, as Yazid Sayegh dubbed it, is now more firmly entrenched and more tyrannical than in the Mubarak era. Another reason that the popular uprising of January 25th could not become a revolution is that the social movements of the urban intelligentsia and the workers were largely detached from each other. In the 2000s, there were brave, even heroic efforts to support and spread the ongoing strike movement by poorly resourced NGOs like the Center for Trade Union and Worker Services, the Coordinating Committee for Trade Union and Workers' Rights and Liberties, and the Egyptian Center for Economic and Social Rights. A small number of individuals like Kamal Abbas, Kamal Abu Eta, Khaled Ali, and Fatma Ramadan, and journalists aligned with the left like Hossam al-Hamalawi, Mustafa Basyuni, Jano Charbel, Adel Zakaria, among others, participated in these efforts. There was an increasing degree of coordination and collaboration between the workers' movement and the left and the democratic forces, after the formation of the Egyptian Federation of Independent Trade Unions on January 30th and the ouster of Mubarak. Collaboration strengthened as the number of strikes and collective actions soared from February 2011 until the July 2013 coup. But this was insufficient to link the two streams of social protest in a way that resembled the coalition of workers and intellectuals in Poland's Solidarity movement, which had decades to develop. Moreover, as was the case since the Tagama's decision to back Mubarak against the Islamists in the early 1990s, most liberal, left, and feminist forces at first supported the July 2013 coup and aligned with autocracy against Islamism. The inability of these forces to break out of the choice between Islamism and nominally secular autocracy has weakened opposition to autocracy in Egypt for over 30 years and continues to do so. The government installed by the July 2013 coup appointed Kamal Abu Etta, who was then the president of the Egyptian Federation of Independent Trade Unions, as Minister of Manpower and Migration. Most of the left mistakenly considered this appointment a victory. A minority, most vocally Fatma Ramadan, were critical of Abu Etta because after becoming a minister, he spoke out against workers continuing to strike. Abu Etta's dismissal in March 2014 made it clear that President Sisi, the current president, was not interested in substantially accommodating the needs of working people. Given the economic situation and the demands of the Saudis and Emiratis, who had showered some $12 billion on Egypt, that would have been very difficult even for a government that was inclined to do so. The strikes of the 2000s and the escalating workers' movement after Mubarak's ouster could not play a leading role in the popular uprising or turn it in a more radical direction, as many on the left imagined it would. This was in part because until the formation of the Egyptian Federation of Independent Trade Unions, there was no organization that could credibly claim to represent anti-regime trade unionists. IFITU was too new, too inexperienced, and largely unfamiliar to workers beyond greater metropolitan Cairo and a few other working class centers like Sadat City and Mahala al-Kubra to fulfill this task. Even more importantly, the demands of public sector workers, who were the main force in the strike movement, although it was much broader than that, were backward looking. They wanted a restoration of the Nasserist social contract. Rather than raise demands for democracy or other critiques of the Mubarak regime, with some exceptions, protesting workers often called for the government and even specific ministers, like Minister of Investment Mahmoud Mohiuddin, to intervene. Sometimes they achieved their demands in this way, so they did not learn anything about the character of the regime. Nonetheless, there were sharp upsurges in workers' collective action in the first quarter of 2014. Although they were far fewer than 2011 and 2012, strikes and other collective actions remained well above historic levels throughout 2015 and 2016. These actions were all locally led with no national leadership or coordination or strategy. Both neoliberalism and autocracy remain in place throughout the Arab world. Even in Tunisia, conventional wisdom notwithstanding, a weak procedural democracy provides a screen behind which many figures of the Ben Ali regime have restored their power. Therefore, the issues that prompted the 2011 uprisings are still on the table. Since then, struggles have continued to erupt over the prevailing mode of failed capital accumulation and governance. The 2017 Hirak Rif of Morocco, the 2019-2020 uprisings in Algeria, Sudan, Iraq, and Lebanon, and as we are having this discussion, the unfolding fourth wave of popular mobilization against neoliberal policies in Tunisia since 2011 illustrate the unfinished character of the uprisings that began in 2010-2011. It will take many years for the final outcome of these struggles to be determined. France began its trajectory towards a republic in 1789, but that republic was not securely established until after 1870. There is no reason to expect the Arab region to transform itself more quickly, whatever the end result will be. One thing that appears to have changed is that whereas in 2011, Egypt was a leading factor in the spread of the popular movement to other Arab countries, it is no longer playing that role. In part, this is because the Sisi regime has repressed all forms of political debate. In part, it is because the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia have consolidated their grip as the leading forces of reaction in the region, backed, unfortunately, by the United States. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel. Our next speaker is Nancy Aqil. Nancy, it's all you.
Thank you, Hisham, and thank you, Larry, and thank you for having me today. It's always very difficult to speak after Joel's articulate presentation, but I will try. I think I'm just going to move straight to the present moment about the extent of repression of the current regime. But I want to focus the talk on three main questions. First is, how is the regime able to exercise such repressive power for that long? And the second question is that why does the regime feel the need to go to such extreme measures? And finally, what are the enabling factors internally and externally, which Joel touched upon it by the end. So when we speak about the how is the regime able to exercise such oppressive power, I think it's still continuing to follow its systematic way of institutionalization of repression through laws, and then the repressive practices themselves. And finally, the pretext or the discourse, it spreads through the complete control over the media. When we look at the laws over the past years, there are several laws were issued to stifle freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press. And in addition to that, you had like the terrorism law, which actually had a language that's vague enough that encompasses any act and render it as a breach of security or national security. In addition to that, in 2017, reinstated the state of emergency, which again gives superpower to the president. And finally, in addition to all those laws and the state emergency, they went all the way to changing the constitution itself to grant Sisi the ability to stay in power for a longer intervals and actually renew it for more years. So these are like the overall institutionalization of repression through the laws, and this is how they are actually following that by the repressive practices themselves that have reached a point that I think it's unprecedented in Egypt, and save Syria, I would say, in the Arab region, because we have seen not just scores of political activists and even journalists and artists all thrown in jail, but also the form of repression itself. We're seeing the forced disappearances increasing. We are seeing the number of people who remain in pretrial detentions for years and years, extending, and they have also managed to make that sort of legal by what we call now is the rotation system, where you go into pretrial detentions for 15 days that is renewable by a prosecutor, and then if a judge comes in, they can renew it for 45 days up until 2 years. But before those 2 years end, or even if you get a release order, you find yourself in another case, which starts the clock back again to the beginning of the 15 years. And there are people who are like been in prison, in pretrial detention for years according with that. In addition, for example, another form of the extent of the repression, Egypt now is one of the top 10 countries that conducts executions and have death sentences. So just to give you a brief small figure to illustrate that, in 2016, there were 44 executions. In 2020, in 10 days, there were 49 executions. So you can see the extent to which Egypt has gone to repress people from all background. Of course, then you have the Muslim Brotherhood, and you have former presidential candidates like Abu Futuh. You have former parliamentarian like Ziad Al-Alaini. You have people from like who are journalists, all backgrounds. So this is how the mechanisms that the government use in order to exercise this repression. Meanwhile, it has full control over the media, which is basically spreading and dominating the discourse. Everyone who gets arrested is a terrorist. They managed over the past years to make Muslim Brotherhood and terrorism as synonymous to each other. And by that, anyone who gets taken into custody or charged is seen as a national threat or a terrorist or aiding terrorism. Now, all this is happening. Meanwhile, there's a complete lack of accountability for people who committed torture, killing of protesters, and tortured to death in prison, and even officers who get convicted, and these are very few, they don't get removed from their position, they actually get promoted. And like one of the most striking and ironic examples is, one of them is General Helen Chellaby, who was sentenced in 2003 of a torture case and had a 1-year suspended sentence. But instead of being suspended, he actually continued to get promoted until he, ironically, became the supervisor or overseeing the investigation of the killing of the Italian student Giulio Regini, who died of torture. So there's nothing more stark and ironic more than that. And now he is being almost groomed to be a minister. He's called the terrorist hunter or Sa'id al-Irhabiyin, and he's like glorified in the media. So you see like the contrast where you have complete repression of all sorts of people in society with different backgrounds, and including the private sector itself, having like prominent businessmen like Salah Diab, who has connections even with the Emirates, and still at some point when he made a small mistake, he was thrown in jail. And meanwhile, there's no accountability. So the question is, why does a regime that has such grip and has control over all state institutions feels the need to go to such extreme measures? Well, first of all, this regime came on the heels of a massive massacre. And in addition to that, all the atrocities it committed over the years. And they're very well aware of the concept of the protracted conflict. This is not going to go away. It is known that this is a crisis of legitimacy, that even the Sisi did not take the chance to go into other elections and changed the constitution to extend his stay in power. And the second thing is that the awareness and actual failure to deliver. A lot of people back in 2013 sort of swallowed this kind of oppression, whether because they didn't see other ways or miscalculation, because he presented himself as he is going to stabilize the economy and improve income and unemployment, and he is going to stop the Islamization of the country and protect the minorities and help the flourishing of the private sector. None of this has happened. What is happening right now, except for like the general economic indicators that on the surface that looks like there is some progress, at the same time there is a very huge decline in people's income, high unemployment, deterioration in education, in infrastructure, in health. It is like, and you can see that with the slightest crises that happen, not even a crisis, like when there's a bit of like more rain that happens for over a day or two, then the complete country is in paralysis because of the flooding, because of like the the underlying infrastructure is not maintained, while he is going to do like his own new capital outside and away from Cairo. And that is something that happens that does not affect, as he imagined, one sector of society. It affects like people who has children in very expensive international schools who cannot go back home. And you see like with the slightest event that happens. And of course, recently we have our biggest magnifying glass is the COVID-19. And it shows like the lack of capacity in the health sector, the deterioration of the services, and the regime are so aware of this to the extent there is unprecedented secrecy over numbers and over the data about the number of people who are being who are sick or dying, to the extent that there are some quarantine sites that have the mobile network cut when you go in. It's to that extent, and of course, that is the most important thing for the regime right now, is the silencing and isolation and prevention of information from coming out. And there's like a very recent example is like starking one, and it's like very dramatic, where a hospital had an incident where there was a lack of oxygen in the ICU, which led to the death of 4 people at least. And this was videotaped by one of the relatives of one of the people who was dying. And there was this very dramatic image of a young nurse who's crawling and like in complete distress. Now, the first response from the government was not to investigate the issue. The first response that came out from the Ministry of Health is investigating who allowed the person to take a video of this. And that's very illustrative of the biggest fear of this regime, why it fears a single tweet, why it fears a videotaping by a citizen, because it's that fragile and it is aware of its challenges, and it's aware that whatever big optics and mega projects that they are providing is not really going to cover this for so long. So this is the how and this is the why the regime feels it can do that. But what is really enabling it under this current circumstances to continue to do that? There are some internal factors and external factors. If time allows, I may get to the external factors. But internally, I think the regime has managed to create a dynamic where all players are playing by its rules, where we're talking about state institution, private sector, and the people, including the revolutionary or reformist camp. So with state institution, each state institution, whether we're talking about the judiciary, the police, the media, each are posing on their own to the regime as the most vital element that is connected directly to its survival. So the police showing its brutality even more, the ability to arrest more people, is not just a direct orders that is coming from the regime, but it's also exposing to the regime as an essential element, an essential institution for that. So it's a self-protection for the institution itself. The same thing with the judiciary, the same thing with Al-Azhar, all and education, the academia. So all state institutions are playing their own role on their own in a not or coordinated way, but in an efficient way that maintains what the regime actually wants. The same thing with the private sector under the current patronage system, and I'm sure like Am will talk about this, and the regime is exploiting this to the biggest degree. So, for example, it uses Al-Azhar to sort of talk about or be the PR for the regime and issuing fatwa about the response that Egypt could have against Ethiopia because of the conflict over the dam, up to talking about the survival ships, which is an initiative that Egypt is having against like the illegal immigrants from Egypt. And the trouble is that it's not just the state institutions that are trapped into this kind of dynamic, it's also the people themselves, where the people reach the point that any problem, the resort or the solution of it is a security solution. That people started informing on each other to the extent it's like it was published as a sort of Black comedy or irony, where a group of upper class women had a party where they had cakes in the form of genitals. And the response of the citizens is they went and reported them to the police. This is to what extent that the regime has created this dynamic. We're all playing by its rule, and all the others, and Al-Azhar also played like its own role in this particular trivial incident that issued a fatwa that it's haram to have cakes with genital formation. And we end up, us or the people who are trying to create change, falling into this trap because we're playing their game and just mainly playing into their hands, because we hail Al-Azhar when they issue a fatwa saying that it's not justifiable, that women's clothes does not justify rape. And we say like, oh, this is amazing. Or say that it's okay that we can ask for forgiveness for a woman who committed suicide because like when she was gay, and say like that it's okay to do that. And we just marvel when we hear something like that. But then these are the same corrupt institutions that are not legitimate, that we want to change its relation, but we even fall into the trap of following the optic game of the regime, where, for example, they're always talking about numbers. For example, they would say, oh, we don't have the any political prisoners, and we say there are 60,000. None of us have the accurate numbers actually, or have like evidence on it because of the lack of transparency. I'll stop now, and if there's an opportunity, I'm going to talk about the external enablers that's allowing the regime to continue on its challenges. But thank you.
Thank you very much, Nancy, for your presentation. Next in the lineup is Amr Hamzawi. Amr.
Thank you, Hisham. Thank you, Larry. It's a pleasure to join you and join Joelle and Nancy in a presentation or in a discussion, I have to say, on incomplete struggles in Egypt 10 years after 2011. Let me go back to a point which Joel made in his presentation, on how the years before 2011 were related to what surfaced or what continued to surface in 2011 in the form of a broad uprising, and focus on the fact that the struggles, social, economic, and political struggles in Egypt have never stopped, even since 2013. And here is a point which I would like to focus on, and Joel made it clear in reference to working class struggles, to the labor movement, that quantitatively the frequency, participation of protest activities have been varying since 2013. We had an ongoing high until 2016. It's been declining in the last years due to different reasons, not only to repression, to other reasons which I will outline as well. But these struggles continue even under severe repressive parameters, and the same struggles continue politically and continue economically. And so I just would like to start by saying that Egypt, under the current autocracy, which is a continuation of Egyptian governments since the 1950s, and even the 2 years between 2011 and 2013 were no exception to that. Under the signs of an ongoing autocracy, economic, social, and political struggles within state institutions and outside of state institutions have continued. So the first point I'm trying to make is a point in relation to continuity. We are still pretty much in the July Republic, which was established since 1954, in which key stakeholders within the state apparatus have come to be the army, the security apparatus, and key elements in the state bureaucracy, or key institutions within the state bureaucracy, including the judiciary. And these institutions have been ruling Egypt since 1954 in an autocratic manner, in which social protest is accepted to a slight extent, political protest is not tolerated, and economic struggles are mediated primarily by state institutions. I very much appreciate the reference which Rochelle made to pre-2011 labor struggles, where labor movement was calling on state ministers to interfere, to the perception of the state as a mediator, the state as the final arbiter of economic and social struggles has been established since the 1950s and continues to exist up until today. So in a way, the current conditions is no exception to what we've been having since the 1950s. The second point I would like to make is, and of course Nancy outlined it very clearly, even if we make an argument for continuity, we are looking at, in terms of repression, in terms of the outreach of state institutions, in terms of repressive measures against citizens, against civil society organizations, against the labor movement, against voices of dissent within, be it state institutions or in academia, that the scale and intensity of repression is different than what we had, especially before 2011. Now, beside establishing this as a fact, I would like to focus my presentation on the question of what else. Why has the current regime managed to stabilize since 2013? And so there are 5 issues which I would like to reference quickly within the time limit that Hisham shared with us, to draw your attention to additional factors which have enabled the regime to stabilize in the last, meanwhile, 8 years, almost 8 years. The first factor is related to the social and economic performance of the regime. And of course, one can always take issues with what's happening on the ground and how far our numbers of macroeconomic, related to macroeconomic and social indicators are relevant. But I have been seeing a gradual improvement in at least 2 key indicators, the poverty and the unemployment rate. So the unemployment rate in Egypt have come down throughout the last 4 years, from 14% in 2017 to, as of now, less than 10%, reported for 2020, 9%. The poverty rate has come down from 32% to around 29%, once again within the same time frame, so in the last 4 years. And I believe if we extend our analysis of the economic and social situation into indicating, into including indicators such as what citizens perceive in terms of whether citizens continue to expect the state to deliver for their bread and butter, whether citizens trust in state institutions and the public sector, or trust in the government, or trust in the private sector. And here are interesting surveys which the Arab Barometer and other institutions have been doing in recent years, which indicate a higher level of trust citizens have in the capacity of the state, the government, to take them out of their social and economic, ongoing social and economic crises. So we have 2 issues here with regard to the economic and social performance. One, an improvement in some macro and social economic indicators, primarily unemployment and poverty. Of course, there are other indicators which are not improved, such as the debt deficit and so on and so forth. However, coupled with the perception of citizens that it is the government which will ultimately deliver to their bread and butter issues, it is a government which will ultimately enable them to a better social and economic situation, continues to persist, and enables the regime to present itself, enables the government to present itself as the only game in town. Citizens do not look to opposition movements, majority of citizens do not look to to political actors, expecting solutions from them for their ongoing economic and social crises. They turn to the government. They continue to turn to the government, even when they are facing economic and social hardships. And this is very much the legacy of the 1950s and 1960s. This is very much the legacy of the July Republic, which established itself as the only player in the economy, as the only player in relation to social factors, and as the final arbiter in politics, which would let some political contestation happen or would rule out any political contestation. So, for example, under former President Mubarak, we had a bit of political contestation, especially in the last years before 2011. Right now, we have we could hardly find any forms of political contestation under the government of President Sisi. However, the state continues to be the place where citizens turn for expecting solutions for their economic and social hardships, and there are no other actors to which citizens can turn. So the improvement in some indicators, notably unemployment and poverty, coupled with a wide perception that it is only the state which can solve it, continues to enable the current government to stabilize, continues to enable it to present itself as the only game in town. The second factor I would like to refer to is an institutional factor. And here is a big issue, I guess, for anyone who lived through the years 2011, 2012, 13, and post-2013, and would be able to compare them to the situation right now. I believe one of the byproducts of the democratic uprising in 2011 has been, or was, especially in the years 2011, 12, and 13, and even to an extent until 2014, a deterioration in institutional capacities. And Egyptians, since the 1950s, if not earlier, have been always have known their government to show its ability to manage at least key social economic conflicts. That massive deterioration in institutional capacities in Egypt shocked Egyptians. If Nancy was referring that as of now, even face hardships in terms of their kids going to school and coming back from school on exceptional days, in exceptional occasions. If any one of us lived through 2011 to 2013 and 14, this was a daily feature of what was going on in Egypt. The lack of institutional capacities to enable citizens to manage their daily life. In educational, in healthcare issues, even in transportation issues. And I believe the shock which Egyptians experienced in the years following the democratic uprising continues to sit very deep, creating a sense of disenchantment with the potential outcome of any protest movement, making them fearful of what would happen next. And the government capitalizes on this perception in a daily fashion. If you go back and look at the discourse, and there are elements of a formal government discourse which has been emerging, the formal governmental discourse has been emerging increasingly in the last years. And this discourse focuses on the fact that without stable institutions, without a strong state, the strong state doctrine, which has been pushed forward in the last years, is a constant reminder to Egyptians that the shock of the years following the democratic uprising, in which institutional capacities were deteriorating to the extent that citizens were having great troubles managing their daily life, that this should not happen again. And that the only guarantee or guarantor for this not to happen is having a strong state. And in a way, as the official discourse silences issues pertaining to human rights, issues pertaining to repression, be it representing them as single cases or diminishing their significance and their importance, it pushes forward that, I would say, corporatist vision of the state being able to facilitate the life of its citizens, of course, highlighting progress in some social and economic sectors, highlighting the fact that from a security perspective, Egypt seems to be in a better place, even when we of course look at the frequency of terrorist attacks, how it looked a few years ago, how it looks now. These are elements of corporatist fashioned state discourse or state doctrine, which presents itself as an antithesis to what happened following 2011, 12, and 13. And it presents itself as the continuation of the longer legacy of the Egyptian state as the firm, strong actor in society, which enables citizens to go about their daily lives and daily businesses and so on and so forth. The third factor I would like to mention in terms of regime or government stabilization strategies and techniques is the very fact that the government has fashioned, beside the corporatist discourse, capitalizing on the strengths of state institutions and on the just nature of state actions, notwithstanding what Joel was referring to in terms of what has been happening to working class Egyptians, and there's even a recent case of the Hadid was-Sulb factories and what's happening to them. But notwithstanding that, the second, besides the corporatist doctrine, the government has pushed forward a populist doctrine as well, to which not only the state bureaucracy, the civilian state bureaucracy is contributing, but to which religious institutions have been contributing as well. And so the reference by Nancy to the role of Al-Azhar, or to the role of ministry, to the role of the ministry, which I would like to refer to, the Ministry of Religious Affairs, in different ways, there's a populist discourse which has emerged to present the government from the president downward to the cabinet and so on and so forth, and the state bureaucracy to present itself as a guardian not only of key social, economic, and security interests of the majority of Egyptians, but as a guardian of morality as well. And this perception of the government guarding morality, the government presiding over society to guard morality in difficult times, in times of, from a moral perspective, for religious institutions and even non-religious institutions, where breaches are happening to morality everywhere, where this perception of, this populist perception of the government securing, guarding, and guaranteeing morality is a key element of what the government in Egypt after 2013 has been referring to stabilize its role amid increased signs of repression. The fourth factor I would like to refer to is what I, in a joint paper with my colleague, Nathan Brown of George Washington University, what we refer to as technocracy, as opposed to bureaucracy in Egypt. There's a trend in Egypt, and I differ with Nancy's assessment of how the government is handling the pandemic and post-pandemic, or we were still in the pandemic, of course. So the impacts of the pandemic socially, economically, but mainly on the healthcare system. I believe we're seeing signs of a growing, which actually, and it's not ironic, they take us back to what was happening in Egypt under former President Mubarak before 2011, the emergence of different centers of technocracy within the civilian state bureaucracy that were back before 2011 contesting a better share of the decision-making power. Some of you will remember the constitutional amendments of 2007, which were dual in terms of their nature. There was a great element of despotism into them, but there was an element of technocracy, increasing the outreach and the share of power for civilian institutions, primarily the cabinet, and more specifically, the office of the prime minister. And if you look at Egypt now, we're seeing a return to that trend, that technocratic trend, where civilian institutions are managing a key challenge in a manner in which the army hasn't interfered, in which the security services have not been interfering, where a technocratic management has been pushed forward. And I believe the government is capitalizing on this image as well. Technocracy standing for efficiency, for expertise, for capacity of the government to solve endemic social and economic crises. A few days ago, the president, accompanied by the cabinet, was in one of the impoverished sections in Cairo, Azbit al-Hagana, for those who know Cairo well. Coverage is actually exactly this image of a technocratic government which is on the ground to solve problems, notwithstanding any forms of contestation. Of course, the only voice heard is the voice of the government. The only voice heard is the voice of leading technocrats within the government, the prime minister, the minister of planning, the minister of finance, the minister of, with regard to COVID-19, the minister of health, the minister of education. And I have to say, they are doing a better job than a couple of years ago in terms of even informing the public, of showcasing what they're doing, of communicating their plans. So in a way, what I'm referring to is a combination of technocracy and improved governance with regard to public policy making, with regard to the implementation of public policies tackling social and economic issues. Once again, this is managed by the government. This is not an issue where stakeholders, other stakeholders are being listened to. They are assumed to be to be pushing in the same direction like the government. When the president and his cabinet visited the impoverished section or neighborhood in Cairo, Azbit al-Hagana, I'm sorry, no one, citizens were presented cheering for the president and the cabinet, and it gives you in a symbolic way the sense of when citizens are called on to basically say yes to what's going on. So their voices are not heard, their voices are assumed to be on the side of the government. So to sum up, beside repression, there are other factors, domestic. I did not refer to external factors. Maybe we'll have time in the discussion. There are other factors for the persistence, for the stabilization of the government after 2013, after the democratic uprising, which are related to the shock following the uprising and its social and economic impacts, the disenchantment, the fatigue, which everyone continues to sense in Egypt with regard to protest activities and protest dynamics. And secondly, the combination of corporatist, populist, and technocratic elements in what the government post-2013 has been doing and has been suggesting to Egyptians and presenting itself as not only the savior with regard to security, but the only game in town when it comes to getting Egyptians out of the ongoing endemic social and economic hardships. Let me stop here.